burning trust. The first time I met Daniel Reeves, he was arguing with a fire behavior specialist about an evacuation model, and I was standing 50 feet away, wondering if this was how I was going to die. Not in the blaze itself, but from the sheer incompetence of the man coordinating the evacuation logistics. My name is Jake Sullivan. I'm 25 years old, and I work as a fire behavior specialist for the U.S. Forest Service out of the Rocky Mountain region. I've got 7 years of wildland firefighting experience, starting as a hotshot crew member when I was 18, working my way up through seasonal assignments until I specialized in fire behavior modeling and prediction. I'm good at reading fire. I'm less good at reading people, which is why I was completely unprepared for what Daniel Reeves was about to teach me. The fire was called the Copper Ridge Incident. It started on a Tuesday in August at 2:47 p.m. near the town of Silverton, Colorado, in the San Juan National Forest. Initial reports suggested a lightning strike had ignited a lodgepole pine stand. By the time I arrived at the incident command post at 16:30, approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes after ignition, the fire had consumed 2,100 acres and was moving at approximately 2 miles per hour under current conditions. The infrastructure coordinator was a guy named Daniel Reeves. He was 28, worked for the County Emergency Management Office, had impeccably organized files, and what appeared to be a fundamental misunderstanding of fire behavior escalation patterns. "We need to establish an evacuation perimeter," he was saying when I walked into the command tent. He was pointing at a map with the precision of someone who understood logistics, but not fire physics. Current fire behavior suggests a 2-mile buffer from the active fire front. That gives us approximately 60 minutes before the perimeter becomes compromised. That calculation assumes static fire behavior, I said, because apparently this needed to be stated. The fuel moisture content is 6%. The wind is sustained at 15 knots with gusts to 24, and the topography funnels wind directly toward the residential zones. Fire behavior won't stay static. It will accelerate. Based on what model? Daniel asked. Based on fire physics, I said. Rothermill's surface fire spread model accounts for fuel type, moisture content, wind speed, and slope. When you integrate those variables, you get a theoretical prediction, Daniel interrupted. We're implementing a 2-mile perimeter based on current observation. We escalate if conditions warrant escalation. That's how emergency management works. I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked at Patricia Torres, the incident commander, who'd been mediating conflicts like this since the fire started. Jake's right about the acceleration potential, Patricia said carefully. But Daniel's right that we can't evacuate people based on theoretical models. We need a graduated response. Current perimeter is 2 miles. We station personnel at the 1.5-mile mark with evacuation notification systems active. If fire behavior escalates as predicted, we initiate full evacuation of the outer perimeter at the 1.5-mile warning threshold. It was a compromise that recognized both the fire physics and the logistical reality of evacuating people without panicking them unnecessarily. I didn't love it. Daniel clearly didn't love it either, but it was workable. What happened over the next 48 hours was a masterclass in why fire behavior models exist and what happens when you don't take them seriously enough. The fire did accelerate. By 1900 Tuesday, approximately 16 hours after ignition, it had consumed 4,700 acres and was moving at 3.2 miles per hour. By 9 o'clock Wednesday, it had moved to 8,400 acres and was sustaining 4.1 miles per hour velocity. The growth rate wasn't the impossible 8,400 acres in 90 minutes. It was the real, terrifying progression of a wildfire that had entered the exponential acceleration phase due to escalating fuel consumption, topography funneling, and wind pattern intensification. At 11:30 Wednesday morning, Daniel activated the outer perimeter evacuation, not because he suddenly believed in fire behavior models, but because the fire had visibly accelerated beyond the predictions he'd been skeptical about. And he was smart enough to recognize that his skepticism was wrong and adjust accordingly. "We're starting full evacuation of the 2-mile-plus perimeter," he reported, coordinating with county law enforcement and emergency response. "That's approximately 3,100 residents. Highway 550 is our primary evacuation corridor. I'm implementing staged traffic management." What impressed me, watching him work, was that Daniel wasn't defensive about being wrong. He was immediately focused on managing the new reality. He'd shifted from 2-mile perimeter is sufficient to the fire is behaving exactly as Jake predicted. Now, how do we keep people safe given that information? By 1400 Wednesday, the fire was within 1.8 miles of the main residential perimeter, and Daniel had successfully evacuated 2,700 of the 3,100 residents in the threatened zones. The remaining 400 were either refusing evacuation or had limited mobility and required specialized transport. "We've got traffic backup on Highway 550 extending to Silverton proper," he reported at 14:15. "I've got 340 residents refusing evacuation, saying they want to shelter in place and protect their properties. The remaining 60 are in the North Valley with limited access routes." "What's your evacuation timeline for the holdouts?" Patricia asked. 30 minutes if we push hard. 45 to be safe if we account for people being difficult," Daniel said. He looked at me. "Jake, what does your model say about fire progression in the next hour?" "Current conditions suggest another acceleration," I said. I was monitoring the live fire progression on thermal imaging, watching the heat signatures grow and spread. The wind is sustained at 22 knots with gusts to 35. Fuel moisture has dropped to 4%. I'm projecting fire reaching Miller Creek, that's the natural barrier before residential areas, in approximately 90 minutes. After Miller Creek, progression accelerates significantly because the topography opens up toward town. "So we have approximately 75 minutes to get the last 400 people out," Daniel said. He wasn't panicking, he was calculating. "That's tight but possible if we deploy additional resources." "Actually," I said, "there's another option." The option was a strategic fuel reduction burn on the eastern slope that would create a fire break strong enough to slow the main fire's progression through the residential zone's approach corridor. It was high risk. If the burn escaped containment, it could create a second fire that might trap evacuees. But if it worked, it would buy critical time for Daniel's evacuation operations. "That's dangerous," Daniel said immediately. He wasn't dismissing it, he was acknowledging the risk. "But if it works, it buys us the time we need." "If it works," I agreed. "If it doesn't, we've potentially made things worse." Patricia made the call. "Do the burn. Daniel, accelerate evacuation. I want every available resource moving people out of those corridors. Jake, you manage the burn operation. You own the risk." The burn operation happened at 1600 Wednesday. It was the kind of firefighting that looks simple on paper and feels like playing God when you're actually doing it, creating fire to fight fire, hoping that the one you light stays under control while you're fighting the one that isn't. I was on the eastern slope with 7 firefighters, all of us in full protective gear, all of us very aware that the wind could shift and turn our controlled burn into our funeral pyre. We set the burn in a calculated pattern, starting at the northern edge, working south, maintaining sight lines and escape routes. The goal was to create a fuel-reduced zone approximately 300 meters deep that would slow the main fire's rate of advance. The main fire was visible from our position, now approaching 11,000 acres, a massive orange wall consuming the landscape, throwing embers that travelled fast enough to start spot fires hundreds of meters ahead of the main front. The heat was intense even from 400 yards away, the roar of the fire a constant, overwhelming sound. "Burns holding," one of my firefighters, Marcus, reported at 16:30. "Patterns clean, containment is good, no spot fires on the near side." "Main fires moving toward Miller Creek," I said, monitoring the progression on thermal imaging. "Current rate suggests it reaches the creek in approximately 90 minutes. That gives us until 1800 before the fire starts pushing toward residential areas." "Daniel says evacuation is at 87% complete," Patricia reported through radio. "Last 400 are moving now. Estimated clear time is 17:45. It would be tight. 15 minutes of safety margin if everything went perfectly. Zero margin for error. At 17:15, the main fire reached Miller Creek. What happened next was exactly what I'd predicted and hoped wouldn't happen. The topography opened up on the residential side of the creek, the fuel density increased, and the fire's rate of advancement accelerated significantly. Instead of the 4.1 miles per hour we'd seen in the open forest, it jumped to 5.7 miles per hour in the denser fuel zone. "Fire's accelerating," I reported. "New rate of advance suggests it reaches the residential perimeter in approximately 35 minutes. "Evacuation is at 94% complete," Daniel reported back. "Last 60 residents are clearing Highway 550 now. Estimated full clear is 17:45. 30 minutes of safety buffer had just compressed to 10. At 17:22, the eastern slope burn caught the main fire's attention. The fuel-reduced zone we'd created actually worked. The fire hit the burned area, and its rate of advance slowed noticeably as it consumed pre-burned landscape instead of full-density fuel. It wasn't a complete stop, but it was enough of a slowdown to give Daniel the extra minutes his evacuation needed. "Evacuation is complete," Daniel reported at 17:39. "All 3,100 residents have cleared the 2-mile-plus perimeter. We have 3 people sheltering in place by choice in fire-resistant structures with evacuation routes still available." By 18:30 Wednesday, the strategic burn had slowed the fire's advance enough that residential areas, while threatened, were no longer in immediate danger. The fire would continue burning for the next 23 days, consuming a total of 47,200 acres before containment was achieved. But people were alive. The 3 who'd chosen to shelter in place were safe. And I had a completely different understanding of Daniel Reeves than I'd had 36 hours earlier. I first talked to Daniel in person, not through radio, not through incident command coordination, but actually standing next to each other at 1900 Wednesday evening. The crisis had stabilized enough that we could breathe. The command post had shifted from emergency response mode to sustained operations mode, and I found Daniel outside the tent, sitting on the edge of a supply truck, looking like he'd been through something that fundamentally changed his understanding of how the world worked. "The burn worked," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been monitoring the fire progression. "You created a fuel-reduced zone, the main fire hit it, and it slowed down enough for evacuation to complete." "That was the plan," I said. "Risky plan, but it was the plan." "You risked a second fire starting to slow a first fire so that people could evacuate safely," he said. "And it worked." "This time it worked," I said. "It could have gone differently. The wind could have shifted. The burn could have escaped containment. We could have created a worse situation." Daniel looked at me. "But you calculated that risk. You understood the variables. You made a decision based on actual fire physics, not hope. And you were skeptical of fire behavior models because you operate on data and observation, not theory," I said. "That's not wrong. You were protecting people from being evacuated unnecessarily based on speculation. You just happened to be wrong about what fire would do once it had the conditions to accelerate." I was very wrong, Daniel said. You predicted acceleration. I predicted stability. You were right. Because I study fire, I said. That's my job. Your job is evacuating people, and you did that perfectly, even while being skeptical of my predictions. We needed both. The fire behavior specialist saying, accelerate your timeline, and the emergency manager saying, but we need to do this carefully so we don't panic people unnecessarily. The argument between us was actually the reason the evacuation worked. Daniel smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. Not professional, not polite, but the smile of someone who'd come to terms with being wrong about something important and discovering that being wrong didn't matter as much as being willing to adapt. I spent 36 hours thinking you were overestimating danger, he said. Then I spent the next 12 watching you calculate danger exactly and manage it appropriately. I spent 36 hours thinking you were endangering people, I said. Then I spent the next 12 watching you coordinate the most efficient evacuation I've ever seen, even while managing the logistics of people refusing to cooperate. We stood there in the cooling evening, both of us exhausted, both of us freshly aware that the person we'd been criticizing might actually be someone worth listening to. What happened over the next 23 days of fire containment was something I didn't expect. Daniel and I became partners instead of adversaries. It started practically. The incident command post needed someone to translate fire behavior predictions into evacuation timeline recommendations. I needed someone to understand the logistical constraints of implementing those recommendations. Daniel and I started doing briefings together. Me explaining the fire behavior model. Daniel explaining the evacuation constraints. Both of us arriving at better decisions because we had to reconcile our different perspectives. By day 5, we were eating meals together at the command post. By day 10, we were having conversations that extended past operational necessity. Daniel asking about fire behavior science. Me asking about emergency management logistics. Both of us discovering that the other person's field was genuinely interesting. By day 15, I realized I was looking forward to seeing him at the briefings more than I was focused on the fire itself. By day 20, Daniel made a comment about fire behavior becoming a conversation about why fires behaved that way, and I understood that I was in love with him. By day 23, when the fire was finally contained at 47,200 acres, with 0 deaths and only 3 structures lost, Daniel and I were standing on the eastern slope, the slope where we'd done the strategic burn that had saved lives. The fire's going to recover from this, Daniel said, looking at the burned landscape. The forest will grow back, the ecosystem will rebuild. So will we, I said. This incident will become history. What matters is what we build after. He turned to look at me. I came into this thinking fire behavior models were theoretical predictions used to justify conservative emergency responses. I still think they're predictions, but I also think they're the reason 3,100 people got out safely, and I think you're the reason I understand why that matters. I kissed him there on the burned slope, with the smell of smoke lingering in the air, and the specific understanding that this man had disagreed with me, listened to me, and trusted me even before he believed I was right. Epilogue. 4 months later. Winter in Colorado is beautiful if you like cold and snow, and completely miserable if you're thinking about everything that hasn't happened yet. Daniel and I were sitting in a cabin outside Silverton, watching snow fall on the landscape that had burned in August. The forest was already recovering, saplings growing in the ash, wildlife returning, the specific resilience of nature that doesn't care about human catastrophes and rebuilds anyway. The county wants me to work on a comprehensive emergency management protocol for the next fire season, Daniel said. He was reading from his laptop. They want to integrate fire behavior modeling with evacuation planning from the start, rather than implementing it mid-crisis. So they're admitting that fire behavior models are essential, not theoretical, I said. They're admitting that we managed a successful evacuation of 3,100 people because we had accurate fire behavior predictions integrated with emergency logistics, he said. Which, yes, includes admitting that your fire behavior model was correct. Don't be smug about it. I'm being exactly the right amount of smug about it, he smiled. I'm recommending that you be part of the planning committee. Full integration of Forest Service fire behavior with county emergency management. You and me arguing about fire behavior and evacuation logistics until we come up with something brilliant. That's a terrible idea. We'll drive each other crazy. You'll drive each other crazy and then you'll figure out something brilliant, Daniel said. That's what you do. That's what we do. The snow kept falling. Outside, the burned forest was sleeping, preparing for spring. Inside, Daniel and I were planning the next season. Not just of fire season, but of whatever this was becoming. A partnership built in crisis, tested against danger, and strengthened by the specific kind of trust that comes from watching someone you care about do something terrifying with competence and precision. I love you, Daniel said. It wasn't a question, not even exactly an admission. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same clarity he brought to evacuation logistics. I know, I said. I've been waiting for you to figure that out. Arrogant, he said. Accurate, I corrected. I could read the signs. You could read fire, he said. Reading me is a much smaller skill set. Actually, I said, reading you turned out to be the most important thing I've learned. He kissed me, and outside the snow continued falling on the recovering forest. Nature's reminder that even the worst disasters eventually become history. And what matters is what you build afterward.